Welcome, everyone, to my session, Creating a State of Relaxed Alertness for Recent Arrivals. I feel really honored to be a part of the ML Summit this year, so thank you for joining in. A little bit about myself. My name is Damaris Gutierrez. My pronouns are she, her. I am a nationally board certified teacher in English as a new language, and I currently serve as an elementary bilingual ESL specialist here in San Antonio, Texas. And before I served in this position, I was a newcomer ESL teacher at the elementary level. And I had the opportunity to teach children who had refugee status, and they were resettled here by our local resettlement agencies. And within my classroom, 1 year, I had up to 11 different languages. So that was really exciting and fun, and it definitely has shaped the educator that I am today. So I'm going to kick off with a story, and I find inspiration all around me, and especially with the people and the children that I have had the honor to work with or continue to work with. And I think about a lot of times people may not know that they inspired me, but I really center words and stories that they do tell me. So I have a near and dear friend, a former work colleague who currently continues to teach our recent arrivals. And I remember she will always say, the kids are finally ready to learn. And for me, that felt like an awkward or weird statement to say about children. I'm like, what do you mean that they're ready to learn? Aren't all children ready to learn? That's what I would think. But I would listen, and through the conversation, what came to light was when she mentioned that her students were ready to learn, what she was describing was that the children had adjusted to being in the new school system, and they were also really engaged in her lessons and were present. That means that they were actively a part of the learning experience inside the classroom. And so, as we all know, that all of our children enter our classrooms ready to learn, right? And so through our words, we can empower and really share what their experiences are. And so I think a way to kind of shift that language of saying that, oh, they're finally ready to learn is that, you know what, I've created this relaxed, alerted state for my students. And so the reason why I named the title of the session the way I did, because it is heavily influenced by the work of Zaretta Hayman. And so her book of culturally responsive teaching and the brain really dives further into this concept. I learned about this book through my amazing professional learning network on Twitter. And so the ML book club chat, they featured this book a few years ago, and that's how I became aware of her work. I was able to revisit it again when preparing for another professional development through National Board. And this word just really stood out to me in regards to that relaxed, alerted state. And so that is what influenced my title for my session. So creating a state of relaxed alertness for recent arrivals. So we know that we're going to have recent arrivals in our classroom, but how do we create this space for them that's going to meet their needs? So we know the school year is coming up. I know in my state of Texas, we have some districts actually kicking off their jumpstart next week. And so I think it's really important as we enter our schools, and particularly our school buildings, is that we acknowledge and continue to acknowledge the path that everyone has gone through and the experiences that they have lived, because we are currently still within the pandemic, and children and staff may enter with different emotions, with different nerves, and it can feel overwhelming sometimes, especially if you're watching the news. And with that being said, there are certain things that we can always control that's in our locus of control. And one thing that is we can really think about how are we going to better support all of our students, but especially our recent arrivals. And so they're going to enter our classrooms, and I'm new here, and we are there to support them in their educational journey in this new world that they're entering into. And so for me, this is really important. We know our children are coming with cultural and linguistic diversity, and what are ways that we can accept them into our spaces and support them. So, with that said, we discussed a little bit about our current state of what we are living through. We're going to have recent arrivals. And so, Zaretta Hammond's book, she discusses the amygdala. And so, that part of your brain becomes hijacked because you can be in an active state of stress, fear, or anxiety. And what happens to you physiologically is your body is going to release these stress hormones called cortisol. And these stress hormones are going to start blocking your rational thinking and temporarily reduce the capacity of your working memory, making learning difficult. And so to bring this in full circle, as I mentioned, my friend would say, well, the kids aren't ready to learn. And what she's really referring to is that her children are entering the classrooms and they're in this active state of stress and fear. And we know that that physiological takeover of their body does make their learning difficult. And so what we can control in our classroom is how do we create this relaxed state of alertness, okay? And so what that means is this is us creating an optimal learning state for children. That means that we want children to experience a low threat. And we know in our world, we say we're going to lower that affective filter. And this is what we are discussing. We want our students to be alert, paying attention, anticipating their learning. And in terms to the emotional tone of your classroom, again, what are we doing? We are creating a safe space for students' social and intellectual learning. So this is really important for us as we enter back into our classrooms, as we enter into a new unknown space, because again, our children are coming with different lived experiences. And what I want to share with you is just two big ideas of how we can do this. And again, our overarching goal is how can we support our students in very culturally responsive ways. And so, with that said, I'm new here. You're going to have new students who are waiting anxiously to enter your classroom. I can remember having our caseworkers and with the interpreters at times bringing our kids to the door, and you can just see it in their eyes, the anticipation, the nervousness. And so, what is my role as an educator? And it is to create this relaxed alertness for my recent arrivals. So Retta Hammond provides us with so many gems in her book, and this is one of them. It says, if we're going to push dependent learners in positive ways to stretch themselves, we have to offer them a safe community to do it in. Again, when we think about being culturally responsive, that means that we are providing a space that allows students to flourish and become independent learners. That means that, again, what do we know about our students? How do we capitalize on that? How do we create learning experiences that really is in tune to our students if they're coming from a collectivist community? What are those rituals, routines, repetition that's going to support them? And how do we respond to the stress and needs that they have? One way I'm going to share with you is how do we co-construct a classroom space? What does that mean exactly? I really was strategic about the words that I utilize in my presentation today because it's really important that we enter our educational spaces wanting to co-construct, not do to others, but do with others. And so what that means is in my space, myself and my students are going to own it. So let me tell a little story, right? Another story for today. When I entered my classrooms, this is my 10th year in education. I've been out of the classroom for going on almost 4 years now. But previously in my classrooms, I would spend a lot of time. I need my class to look the best. I need my class to really be vibrant and inviting for my students. I wanted some colors. I wanted my bulletin boards to be straight and ready for my kiddos. But is that really what my kids needed? Am I co-constructing the space with them? And in the past, I did not. So I always say I'm a reflective practitioner. What would I do differently? And this is what I want to share with you, what I would do differently. The first is the ethos versus artifacts. So Zaretta Hammond shares with us that there's a tendency to get stuck in how to decorate the room, right? In my story, my room needs to be on point, needs to be together. But what we really need to focus on is not trying to pick out the right cultural artifacts for my kiddos, rather than I need to create the right ethos for my students. That means that what is that social emotional tone that I'm setting up inside of my classroom? So you need to ask yourself, how do we want children to experience their time in our classroom? How do we want them to experience it? What is going to be the spirit of your community then? And for me, I always entered in, I'm creating the space for my students instead of what can we do together? So a way that we can do that, as shared within the text, is this classroom aesthetic and symbols. We have to think carefully about what visuals and displays are on the walls of our classrooms. Do they affirm? Do they validate? Do they build a sense of well-being? And when we say to affirm, we can view it from two lenses. When I'm creating my classroom, am I affirming to my students that I care about them through my actions, through my words? And also, am I affirming their identities that they enter with? How can I validate their stories that they have? How do I create this emotional space for them to feel like they can enter and be their fullest self? And again, trust. That means our kids trust us. We've done this, we've co-constructed it together, and that makes them feel belong. I really enjoyed this portion of the book because it really challenged my previous assumptions about creating space for students. And this is just one way that you can do it in very tangible ways. And so our children bring lots of richness into our classroom. One of the ways that they can bring in elements of themselves, it can be as simple as pictures of themselves, of their families, of their countries that they select and we put up and honor in our classroom, or they can share to the whole group, which we'll talk about in a minute. Another way is I think about my children. I have some children who are from Rwanda, who were from Eritrea, and there was this richness of these woven baskets, as you see here in this picture, with beautiful geometric shapes and color. My husband's from Eritrea. Anytime I walk into my in-laws' house, I can at least find one of these woven baskets somewhere in the home. What are ways that we can bring that into our classroom, where they're bringing in different artifacts, different pieces into our classrooms to make it more home? The next two pictures are pictures from a ceremony that we would have, our celebration that we would have at our campus, and it was the Parade of Nations. And through this time, children came in their traditional clothes from their country, and we celebrated. They walked with their country's flags and with others from their countries, and we would share a few facts about their countries. And so I look at these pictures and what are ways that we could have incorporated the colors, um, the more so their flags into our classrooms that made them feel present, represented. And again, they choose what they want to bring into those classrooms. I love the children's clothing because of the texture of the materials that were used to represent them. What are ways that they can bring that? And again, we know culture is complex, right? And so this is just one way to incorporate culture. It's not the full, all encompassing ways to incorporate our students' cultures there. The other piece is just that naturalistic elements of the air, earth, water, and fire. What are ways that we can incorporate or have space for that in our classrooms? And so, Zaretta Hammond, these are just some ideas that she shares with us. Again, we are, yes, bringing in artifacts, but I'm not choosing them. It's my students. It's driven by my students, by their needs, by their stories. And when we do that, we're creating this emotional, social tone in our classroom that supports our children holistically. So, as my children are bringing in these elephants or these artifacts, you're probably wondering, okay, Damaris, when are you going to get to language development? You have recent arrivals. Yes, that will happen because guess what? Our children are bringing in artifacts, and why not have them show and tell, teach us all? They're experts. And so I think about a book that I really love, Growing Language and Literacy, which is Strategies for English Learners or multilingual learners. And this allows students to really, and I think about my English language proficiency centers, to express their ideas and their feelings. And this can range from a single word, it can include a short phrase. Children can use their full linguistic repertoire. That means that they are able to communicate with a larger class in their native language. We can provide translations or interpretations by a peer, maybe a community member or a family member. So there's different ways. We can't say that our children will not be able to express themselves. In our classrooms, we should be supporting additive bilingualism that allows children to, again, show up as their fullest self. And we honor all languages that they bring and they hold equal value. So this is just one way. When I was a child, show and tell, oh my goodness, I'm shy when I was younger, but show and tell is deeply personal and I can really share who I was with my classroom. That builds relationships. We're hitting the social emotional, the academic, the linguistic, the cognitive development of our students. So again, oral language development, we're doing this naturally at the beginning of the school year and all throughout because we're co-constructing our classroom throughout the year. It's not boom, the kids enter, it's already ready. No, we're going to do this together, we. So the next piece I'm going to share with you is about culturally responsive literature. I love books. You can see my bookshelf behind me. I'm always ordering, buying new books, and children's literature holds a near and dear place to my heart because I just remember having a student who arrived on their first day and reading a book that represented something familiar to them and how engaged they were, how they were in this relaxed state of alertness. And so we can do this through children's literature. And they were so eager to tell me, Miss Gutierrez, through their peers who spoke their same language, that represents my mom. Or, my mom wears a hijab. And just something as simple as that, it seems simple, but it really is meaningful to our children. And that was on their first day of arriving because they saw themselves or familiarity represented in a book. So in our classrooms, we want to affirm our students, affirm them again in two ways, affirm their self-esteem, but also affirm that we care truly about them. And so we say all are welcome. And this should be the overarching culture, regardless of your classroom, but as your school. We also want to validate their stories. And this is why you see this picture again that I am new here. Everyone's is different. Every recent arrival is not the same. We have to know our students, and we can do that by staying curious, asking questions, and not just to the student, but to the larger community. And so this is a great book. Again, I come from an elementary background, but picture books are not just for elementary. This is for all levels. And there are also great graphic novels that are out there for your kiddos or beginners chapter books as well. So when we're talking about books, you always have to put respect on people's names. And so Dr. Bishop is an amazing educator and researcher. And so I am truly about centering voices, especially in research that come from Black, Indigenous, or people of color backgrounds. So we are very maybe familiar with windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors, but I bring it to you today and saying that we have to be intentional with the books that we bring into our classroom. We want our children to see themselves represented, but we also want them to learn more about the global world, but also learn about other people's experiences, which humanizes everyone. And again, they can literally step foot into those experiences through the learning assignments, through the learning tasks that we create for students. So I wanted to bring this in, especially if we're talking about culturally responsive literature. But the big piece too is to be critical of them too, making sure that they are really representing the richness and fullness of our communities that we have the privilege to serve, and not in stereotypical ways. So through our books, right, Damaris, you talked about theory. Okay, how do I do this in my classroom? Well, we may be very familiar with building background knowledge, right? But I really like how growing language and literacy positions it. It means that we are working with the background knowledge that our students have, because they are not empty vessels. We can do this in three ways. We can assess, we can activate, and after we have done those two, we're going to build. So why do I share this with you today? Well, there is this amazing children's literature book that is called Maybe Something Beautiful, and it's about a little girl who wants to transform her neighborhood through art, through murals, through building community and having the collective group come together to beautify this space that they live within. And so how can we work with background knowledge? Well, we're going to assess it. You want to find out what your children know. So I'm going to use this tried and true KWL that I'm going to co-create with my recent arrival. So what do they know about neighborhoods or about mural? And when I'm discussing a mural, I'm going to bring a visual for my children, right? And I want them to see, and they can communicate as we are building this KWL in the most appropriate language that fits them. Because again, if they're recent arrivals and maybe beginner proficiency level learners, we want to make sure that we lower that affective filter and allow them to enter this grade level appropriate lesson. The one piece that you may not be familiar with is the S in the KWL. So after you have learned, you also want to aspire to capture what is something else that you would like to learn more about. When we know what our students know, we can continue to activate. So I can bring in a video clip that's going to bridge what my students know and still need to know in the forefront of their new learning. The next one is, now that we have assessed, we have activated, we're going to build on their background knowledge. And again, you're not going to do all three of these parts in one day. You have to strategically plan out based off of the needs, based off of your unit. And so doing your read aloud as well, you can incorporate building in that background knowledge. And this is a great way to build engagement. So why not bring in an expert? We have many muralists in my city of San Antonio. And so what are ways to bring in the community to support children's overarching learning? So these are just some ways that you can utilize children's literature to build with our children's background knowledge. And it's also tied to our English language proficiency standard here in our learning strategies, which is to use students' prior knowledge and experience to make meaning. So, bringing everything together and discussing ways to create this relaxed alertness. Again, I know school is around the corner. What is something you can do as you walk into the classroom? First is really centering ways of how do we co-construct this space together. I know we talked aesthetically about how to do that, but also thinking about the power dynamics and how are we going to treat each other in this space. If we're co-constructing the walls in the space, whatever artifacts and elements that students are bringing into this classroom, turn it into a show and tell or however you want to phrase it for your students. But this is the opportunity to develop students' oral language, to build community, for students to learn more about their peers, and to stay curious and to ask further questions. Because curiosity, we want to continue to foster all the way through our children's educational experience. The other piece is selecting culturally responsive literature in order to support students' relaxed alertness. That means that makes them feel emotionally and intellectually safe. We can do this again by looking at what are ways that books serve as mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors by Dr. Bishop. But with those books, what do I do with them during my read aloud? Well, I can utilize those books to work with our students' background knowledge. So, knowing what our students know, we can assess what our students know, their background knowledge, we can activate it, and then we can build upon. So, these are just some of the concepts that we have covered here today with working with our recent arrivals, which is a pleasure. So I want to close us out by sharing just some words from our 2021 National Teacher of the Year, Juliana Utue, and I was at the EduColor Summit, which was just the other day, and we had the honor to hear the words of Juliana. And so she shares that holistic learning meets the academic and social emotional needs for all students. So when we're creating this relaxed alertness for our students, we are hitting at their academic and social emotional needs. And this happens throughout our days because again, we want our recent arrivals to be successful in their new educational space. And so we are fostering a culturally responsive classroom that moves our dependent learners into independent lifelong learners. And so I thank you for joining me here today. And thank you again for allowing me to share my story, share my expertise at the ML Summit this year. Thank you again.